The great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched out like a vast bowl carved from living crystal. Thousands of seats rose in perfect circles around the central speaking platform where Ambassador Jake Morrison sat with his hands folded on the polished table. The air hummed with the voices of 100 different species, each sound blending into the constant background noise that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat over the past 20 years. Jake watched the Zephyrian Delegate Zixtal float to the speaking platform, their translucent blue forms shimmering in the artificial light. The Zephyrians always spoke with such certainty, as if the universe had personally whispered its secrets into their crystalline ears. Today would be no different. Jake could already see the way the other delegates leaned forward in anticipation, ready to hang on every word that dripped from Zixtal's vocal membrane. Captain Lisa Hayes sat in the observation deck above, her military uniform crisp despite the long hours they had already spent in this chamber. She had been Jake's advisor for the past 5 years, and in that time she had watched the same performance play out dozens of times. The aliens would gather, they would discuss humanity like they were a problem to be solved, and then they would make decisions about human space without asking what humans actually wanted. Zixtal began to speak, their voice carrying that melodic quality that made other species sway slightly in their seats. Jake had long ago stopped being impressed by the show. The words were always the same, dressed up in prettier language but carrying the same basic message. Humans were too aggressive. Humans were too unpredictable. Humans needed to be watched more carefully. The chamber filled with the soft harmonics of agreement as Zixtal outlined the latest proposal. Human expansion beyond the Terran sector would be suspended indefinitely. The Council had decided that allowing humans to spread further into the galaxy posed too great a risk to established civilizations. The reasons were always the same. Humans asked too many questions. Humans wanted to change things. Humans did not know their place. Jake felt the familiar weight of disappointment settle in his chest. 20 years he had sat in this chamber, trying to build bridges between humanity and the galaxy beyond. 20 years of patient explanation, careful diplomacy, and endless compromise. 20 years of watching his species be treated like dangerous, children who needed constant supervision. The Kitari delegate clicked their mandibles in approval as Zixtal continued. The insectoid creatures had never hidden their distrust of mammals in general and humans in particular. Their clicking sounds filled the chamber like rain on metal as they showed their support for the new restrictions. Jake could see General Vrixith nodding from the military section, their compound eyes glittering with satisfaction. The Viridians added their voices to the chorus of approval, their song-like speech weaving through the chamber in complex harmonies. To most species, the Viridian voice was considered the most beautiful sound in the galaxy. To Jake, it had become the sound of condescension wrapped in pretty music. They sang about the wisdom of limiting human influence, as if humans were some kind of virus that needed to be contained. Zixtal moved on to the next restriction. Human access to advanced shield technology would be revoked. The Council had decided that such powerful defensive systems were too dangerous in human hands. Jake almost laughed at the irony. Humans had helped develop those same shield systems, working alongside Altarian engineers for nearly a decade. Now those same shields would be used to protect ships that would be banned from human space. Captain Hayes shifted in her seat above, and Jake could feel her tension even without looking up. Lisa had spent her entire career working with alien military forces, building joint defense networks and training programs that had kept the rim sectors safe for years. Now she was watching decades of cooperation being swept away by politicians who had never seen combat. The Nephites floating in their environmental suits added their deep, resonant voices to the discussion. Their species was known for wisdom and careful thought, but even they seemed to believe that humans needed to be controlled. They spoke about the necessity of protecting younger civilizations from human interference, as if humanity had not been exploring space for centuries. Jake's aide, a young diplomat named Peter Brooks, leaned over to whisper something, but Jake waved him away. There was no point in taking notes or preparing responses. This was not a discussion. This was a sentencing. Zixtal reached the final item on their agenda. Human voting rights in the Council would be suspended for all matters involving what they called civilized species protection protocols. In practical terms, this meant humans would have no say in any decision that affected their relationships with other species. They would be observers in their own diplomatic future. The chamber erupted in sounds of approval. The Qatari clicked louder, the Viridians sang higher, and the Nephites hummed in their deep, thoughtful way. Even the usually quiet Crystalline Collective pulsed with light in patterns that Jake had learned meant satisfaction. But it was the final speaker who broke something inside Jake that had been bending for 20 years. The Altarian delegate rose on their 6 legs, their fur shimmering in the chamber light. Ambassador Keth Al had worked with humans for years, had been to Earth, had eaten at Jake's own dinner table. When they spoke, their words cut deeper than all the others combined. Keth Al talked about humanity's potential, about how the Council's patience and guidance had helped humans grow beyond their barbaric nature. They spoke as if humans should be grateful for being treated like children who had finally learned not to break the furniture. The other delegates laughed and chirped and hummed their agreement. Even species that Jake had considered friends seemed to find humor in the idea of human gratitude for their own humiliation. Jake stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor in a sound that somehow carried through the vast chamber. The noise level dropped slightly as thousands of eyes and sensors turned toward the human delegation. Lisa Hayes rose in the observation deck above, her hand moving automatically to the insignia on her uniform. One by one, the human diplomatic staff stood with their ambassador, Peter Brooks, who had dreamed of galactic service since childhood. Dr. Karen White, who had spent years developing medical protocols that had saved lives across dozens of species. Commander Ryan Foster, whose joint defense initiatives had protected trade routes throughout the outer systems. Jake reached into his jacket and withdrew the small golden disc that marked him as an official representative of humanity to the Galactic Council. The insignia was simple compared to the elaborate badges and symbols worn by other species, but it had meant everything to him for 2 decades. He placed it carefully on the table in front of his seat. Captain Hayes was the next to move, removing her military liaison badge and setting it on the rail of the observation deck. The sound of metal touching stone seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly quiet chamber. One by one, every human in the chamber removed their credentials and placed them down. 20 years of diplomatic progress reduced to a small pile of abandoned metal. Jake looked around the chamber one last time, taking in the faces and forms of species he had worked with, argued with, and sometimes even laughed with. Some looked confused, others appeared annoyed at the interruption. A few seemed amused by what they clearly saw as another example of human emotional instability. He walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the silence. His staff followed, their own footsteps joining his in a steady rhythm that seemed to mark time, like a funeral march. They reached the great doors that led out of the chamber, doors that Jake had walked through thousands of times over the years. Jake paused at the threshold and turned back to face the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. Thousands of beings looked back at him, waiting to see what dramatic speech the emotional humans would deliver. They expected threats or pleas or some other display of primitive passion. Instead, Jake spoke quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the perfect acoustics of the chamber. "When you realize what you've lost, don't come looking for us." Then he walked through the doors, followed by every human in the building. Behind them, the chamber remained silent for exactly 37 seconds before Zixtal called for the session to continue. After all, there was still important work to be done, and now they could do it without human interference. The doors closed with a soft whisper of moving air, and humanity was gone. 3 months had passed since the humans walked out of the Galactic Council chamber, and the silence felt wonderful to most of the assembled delegates. The great crystal amphitheater hummed with productive conversation as species after species presented their agendas without the constant interruptions that had marked human participation. No more questions about implementation details. No more suggestions for alternative approaches. No more uncomfortable challenges to established procedures. Zixtal floated at their usual position near the central platform, their crystalline form practically glowing with satisfaction. The Zephyrian Council leader had spent decades dealing with human unpredictability, and now they could finally focus on proper governance. The voting on trade route allocations had proceeded smoothly, with the lucrative Outer Rim shipping contracts being distributed among the Qatari trading guilds without a single objection or complicated counter-proposal. General Vrixith clicked, their mandibles in approval as they reviewed the new shipping manifests. The Qatari had immediately claimed the freight routes that human companies had been managing, confident that their efficient military approach would improve delivery times throughout the sector. The insectoid general had never understood why humans insisted on such complex logistics networks when simple point-to-point delivery seemed perfectly adequate. Dr. Emma Carter stood on the observation deck of the research vessel Terra Nova, watching the stars of the Andromeda sector through the transparent aluminum viewport. Her Viridian research partner, Sil Theta, sang softly in the background, their melodic voice weaving through the ship's corridors like living music. Emma had received the recall order that morning, along with every other human scientist in the galaxy. All research missions were to return to Earth immediately. Sil Theta approached with their usual graceful movements, their crystalline form catching the light in patterns that Emma had learned to read over their 3 years of partnership. The Viridians' confusion was evident in the way their internal structures pulsed with uncertain rhythms. They could not understand why humans were abandoning such important work over what seemed like a simple political disagreement. Emma packed her research carefully, including the breakthrough data on exotic matter manipulation that she and Sil Theta had been developing together. The discovery could revolutionize energy production across the galaxy, but now it would return to Earth with her. Sil Theta watched with growing concern as Emma sealed the data containers, their song becoming more discordant with each passing moment. The Viridian tried to explain that surely this was just another example of human emotional instability. They had seen humans react strongly to perceived slights before, usually getting over their hurt feelings within a few days or weeks. Sil Theta was certain that once the humans had time to calm down, they would return, and everything would go back to normal. After all, the research was too important to abandon over politics. Emma simply nodded and continued packing. She had tried to explain human psychology to Sil Theta many times over the years, but some concepts seemed impossible to translate. The idea that humans might make permanent decisions based on principles rather than immediate gain was apparently beyond Viridian understanding. They saw Emma's departure as a temporary tantrum rather than a fundamental shift in human relations with the galaxy. On the other side of the galaxy, the first signs of trouble were beginning to appear in the Zephyrian shipyards orbiting their homeworld. Chief Engineer Colden studied the efficiency reports with growing concern, their multifaceted eyes scanning the data multiple times to make sure they were reading correctly. Production rates had dropped by nearly 15% since the quantum processors installed by human technicians had begun experiencing irregular performance cycles. The processors were marvels of engineering, compact units that managed the complex calculations needed for modern starship construction. The Zephyrians had purchased them from human manufacturers years ago, impressed by their reliability and efficiency. Now those same processors were developing faults that their own engineers could not diagnose or repair. Colden had tried to contact the human technical support teams, but the communication channels had gone silent. The automated systems still functioned, but no human voices answered their requests for assistance. When they attempted to reverse engineer the processors, they discovered layers of complexity that seemed almost impossible. The human designs were elegant in ways that Zephyrian engineering principles could not explain. Admiral Sam Burke supervised the withdrawal of human forces from joint defense stations scattered throughout the rim sectors. His weathered face showed no emotion as he watched his ships prepare for departure, but inside he felt a mixture of sadness and anger that he kept carefully controlled. 40 years of military service had taught him the value of discipline, especially when emotions ran high. General Vrixth met with Burke one final time at the primary defense station, orbiting the binary star system of Kepler's Gate. The Qatari. Commander's compound eyes reflected the station's lights as they assured Burke that Council forces were more than adequate for sector defense. The insectoid general seemed almost eager to see the humans leave, confident that their own military doctrine would prove superior to the complicated joint strategies that humans favored. Burke simply nodded and shook the general's extended claw in the traditional Qatari farewell gesture. He had worked with Vrixth for over a decade, building the defensive networks that had kept the Rim safe from raiders and hostile forces. Now he was watching that partnership dissolve over political decisions made by beings who had never faced combat. Burke kept his thoughts to himself as he boarded his ship for the final time. On Earth, President Helen Ross stood before the assembled representatives of humanity's government and military leadership. The woman who had guided Earth through 2 decades of galactic diplomacy looked tired but determined as she addressed the room. Her words were simple and direct, lacking the elaborate rhetoric that marked most political speeches. Humanity was coming home, she said, and they would focus on being what they had always been. The room was quiet as she spoke about the withdrawal from galactic affairs. No grand declarations of independence or threats of retaliation. No emotional speeches about betrayal or injustice. Just a calm statement that humanity would no longer participate in galactic civilization and would instead concentrate on their own development. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken thoughts and suppressed emotions. Dr. Ryan Foster closed down the last human monitoring station in the neutral zone between Council space and the unknown regions beyond. The quantum sensors had been operating for nearly 30 years, part of an early warning network that monitored space for dangerous anomalies and hostile movements. As the massive arrays powered down, a gap opened in the galaxy's detection grid that stretched across 2 full light years. The monitoring stations had been so reliable that most Council species had forgotten they existed. The data they provided was automatically integrated into navigation systems and threat assessment protocols throughout civilized space. Now that data stream was ending, leaving a blind spot that no one had even considered important enough to mention in the diplomatic discussions. Foster watched the sensor readings fade to 0 as the station's power systems shut down according to his orders. The facility had been his home for 5 years, and leaving it felt like abandoning a living thing. But orders were orders, and humanity was withdrawing from all joint operations regardless of their importance or the relationships involved. The hyperspace lanes that had buzzed with human voices for decades began to fall silent. Traders, explorers, scientists, and diplomats who had maintained constant communication across the galaxy simply stopped transmitting. The absence created a strange quiet that some species found peaceful and others found vaguely unsettling. Council. Leader Zixtal reviewed the latest reports from across their territory and felt satisfied with the progress being made. Trade was flowing smoothly through the new distribution networks. Scientific research continued without human complications. Military operations proceeded according to established protocols. The galaxy was functioning exactly as it should, with proper order and appropriate hierarchy. The Zephyrian leader made a note to commemorate the successful resolution of the human problem in the next council session. It would serve as an example of how patient diplomacy and firm leadership could guide even the most difficult species toward better behavior. Perhaps humans would eventually learn from their isolation and return as better galactic citizens. The galaxy continued to turn, and most of its inhabitants barely noticed that something fundamental had changed. 6 months had passed since humanity's silent departure when the first real crisis struck the core worlds. The massive gravitational anomaly appeared without warning in the Centauri trade corridor, a twisted knot of space-time that threatened to collapse the most important shipping route in the galaxy. What should have been detected days in advance caught the entire Council fleet by surprise. Captain Veltar of the Zephyrian Deep Space Monitoring Ship Crystal Wing stared at his instruments in confusion. The anomaly readings made no sense according to his training. The gravitational distortion was far too large and moving far too quickly for their detection grid to have missed it during regular sweeps. Yet somehow it had appeared as if from nowhere, already at critical mass and growing stronger by the hour. The Zephyrian captain tried to access the early warning protocols that should have predicted such an event, but the data streams he needed were simply not there. For decades, those protocols had relied on information from monitoring stations scattered throughout neutral space, stations that had provided detailed readings on gravitational fluctuations and spatial anomalies across a sphere of influence, stretching hundreds of light-years. Chief Engineer Roy Phillips finished shutting down the last human monitoring station in the neutral zone just as the crisis began to unfold. The quantum sensors that had operated continuously for 30 years went dark one by one, leaving gaps in the galaxy's detection network that no one had bothered to map or understand. Roy had built some of these stations himself, working alongside alien engineers who had never quite grasped the complexity of the early warning systems. The monitoring network had been designed with typical human redundancy, each station covering not just its assigned sector, but providing overlapping coverage that could compensate for equipment failures or hostile action. The aliens had always seen this as wasteful over-engineering, preferring more efficient single-point coverage for their own installations. Now that efficiency was proving inadequate as gravitational sensors across the core worlds failed to provide the detailed readings needed to predict the anomaly's path. Roy watched his instruments go dark and felt a strange mixture of sadness and satisfaction. He had spent his entire career building systems that worked so well that people forgot they existed. Now those same people would learn what happened when reliable systems simply disappeared. The economic impact of humanity's withdrawal was becoming impossible to ignore as trade routes that had operated smoothly for decades began experiencing delays and failures. The Qatari military transport guilds had taken over the major shipping contracts with confidence, certain that their efficient approach would improve on human methods. Instead, they were discovering that human logistics networks were far more complex than they had appeared. General Vrix studied the shipping reports with growing frustration, their compound eyes scanning columns of data that showed mounting delays and cost overruns throughout their new trade empire. The Qatari had assumed that human shipping companies were simply moving cargo from point to point, but the reality was far more complicated. Human logistics involved constant route optimization, predictive maintenance scheduling, and risk assessment, protocols that the Qatari military mind found unnecessarily complex. The Qatari approach was straightforward and logical. Load cargo, travel to destination, unload cargo, repeat. But this simple method was proving inadequate for the vast network of trade relationships that kept the galaxy's economy functioning. Human shipping companies had been managing inventory, flows, coordinating delivery schedules across multiple species, and maintaining backup routes that ensured commerce could continue even during local disruptions. Without those coordination systems, trade began to break down. The Nephites, despite their wisdom, proved too slow for the rapid cargo turnover that modern commerce required. Their thoughtful approach to each transaction meant that ships sat idle in ports while contracts were carefully negotiated and renegotiated. The Viridians were more efficient, but lacked the mathematical frameworks that humans had developed for optimizing complex shipping networks. Dr. Ryan Foster sat in his new laboratory on Mars, monitoring galactic communications from humanity's most advanced listening post. The intercepted transmissions told a story of growing crisis as alien species struggled to replicate systems they had never bothered to understand. Medical emergencies were becoming more common as the universal treatment protocols developed by human researchers began to fail without proper maintenance and updates. The Joint Galactic Medical Consortium had been humanity's greatest contribution. To interspecies cooperation, a network of research facilities and treatment centers that had saved billions of lives over the past century. Human researchers had been responsible for developing the universal antibiotics that worked across species barriers, the surgical techniques that could be adapted for different anatomies, and the psychological support systems that helped beings from different worlds recover from trauma. Dr. Foster had been the lead researcher on the Universal Antibiotic Project, working with samples from over 300 different species to develop treatments that could fight infections, regardless of the patient's evolutionary background. The project had taken 15 years and involved human insights into biological systems that other species found difficult to replicate. Now those systems were failing as alien medical facilities discovered that maintaining human-designed treatments required knowledge and skills that had never been properly transferred. The antibiotics required precise manufacturing processes that human technicians had managed in facilities across the galaxy. Without human oversight, the quality control systems were breaking down, producing medicines that were less effective, or sometimes completely useless. The crisis reached a breaking point when plague struck Kitari Prime, a virulent infection that spread rapidly through the insectoid population centers. The disease should have been easily treatable with standard universal antibiotics, but the Kitari medical facilities discovered that their supplies were no longer effective. Desperate calls went out to human research stations, but the communication, arrays that had once buzzed with cooperative medical consultations, were now silent. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had managed the Kitari Medical Support Program for 8 years before the withdrawal order came. She had worked closely with Kitari physicians to adapt human treatments for insectoid biology, developing specialized protocols that took into account the unique challenges of their physiology. Her research station in the Vega system had been the primary source of medical support for 3 Kitari worlds. Now that station was abandoned, its automated systems still functional, but no longer staffed by human researchers who could provide the expert guidance that alien physicians had come to depend on. The Kitari medical teams found themselves facing a crisis they could not solve with their own knowledge and resources. Sil Theta attempted to contact Dr. Emma Carter as the Viridian computer networks began experiencing widespread failures. The quantum matrices that powered their information systems were degrading without the maintenance protocols that human technicians had quietly managed for years. The failures were subtle at first, minor errors in data processing that seemed like random glitches rather than systematic breakdown. The Viridian scientists' attempts to reach their former human partner met only automated responses. The communication frequencies that had carried constant collaboration between human and Viridian researchers were now monitored only by machines that could receive messages but could not provide the expertise that was desperately needed. The quantum matrices that failed were human innovations, designed using mathematical principles that pushed the boundaries of what Viridian science considered possible. Human engineers had worked alongside Viridian technicians to install and maintain these systems, but the deeper understanding of how they functioned had remained with the human teams. As the failures spread, entire information networks that had operated flawlessly for decades began to collapse. Scientific databases became corrupted, communication systems developed inexplicable delays, and navigation computers began producing calculations that made no sense according to established Viridian understanding of quantum mechanics. On Nexus, Prime Council leader Zixtal received reports that disturbed their crystalline form in ways they had never experienced. Border raids by unknown species were increasing throughout the rim sectors, attacks that seemed to target exactly the right locations at exactly the right times to cause maximum damage with minimum risk to the attackers. The raiders appeared to know exactly when Council patrols would be absent from key positions, exactly which trade convoys would be carrying valuable cargo, and exactly how to strike without triggering the defensive responses that should have protected those regions. It was as if they had access to detailed intelligence about Council military operations and commercial activities. What Zixtal did not understand was that human intelligence networks had been quietly monitoring hostile groups beyond the galactic border for decades. Human analysts had identified patterns of raider behavior, tracked their movements through unexplored space, and provided early warning of potential threats to the Joint Defense Forces. Those intelligence networks had been. 1 year after humanity's departure, the Galactic Council faced its first existential crisis in 3,000 years. The carefully maintained balance of power that had kept peace across the galaxy was crumbling, and none of the Council species understood why their civilization was falling apart so quickly. What had begun as minor inconveniences had escalated into system-wide failures that threatened the foundation of galactic society. Captain Greg Williams monitored galactic communications from a listening post hidden deep within the Terran defense grid. The intercepted transmissions painted a picture of accelerating collapse that even he found shocking. Supply chains that had operated smoothly for centuries were breaking down completely. Territorial disputes that had been peacefully managed for generations were exploding into open warfare. Species that had coexisted peacefully for millennia were now viewing each other as existential threats. The crisis reached its breaking point when the Altarian hegemony launched a surprise attack on the mineral-rich Vega system, claiming that economic necessity justified their aggression. The Viridians, who had held mining rights in the system for over 2 centuries, responded with their own military forces. Within days, the first interspecies war in 2,000 years had begun, sending shockwaves throughout the galaxy. Greg had served as a liaison officer with both species during joint military exercises, and he knew that neither the Altarians nor the Viridians were naturally aggressive. But without the diplomatic framework that humans had quietly maintained, cultural misunderstandings that should have been resolved through negotiation were instead escalating into violence. The psychological profiles and cultural translation matrices that human diplomats had developed over decades were irreplaceable tools that no other species had bothered to learn. Dr. Susan Blake received increasingly desperate communications from her former alien colleagues at her research facility on Europa. The former head of the Galactic Peacekeeping Institute was watching the collapse of everything she had spent her career building. The messages she received painted a picture of diplomatic chaos as species after species discovered that they could not resolve conflicts without human mediation. The Peacekeeping Institute had been humanity's greatest diplomatic achievement, a network of conflict resolution specialists who had prevented countless wars through patient negotiation and innovative compromise solutions. Human diplomats had possessed a unique combination of empathy and pragmatism that allowed them to understand the emotional needs of different species while finding practical solutions that everyone could accept. Dr. Blake had developed the protocols that human peacekeepers used to mediate disputes between species with fundamentally different value systems. The process required deep understanding of each species' psychology, cultural history, and evolutionary background. Human diplomats had spent years learning to think like Qatari warriors, Viridian artists, Nephite philosophers, and dozens of other species, developing the mental flexibility needed to find common ground between incompatible worldviews. Now those skills were gone, and the galaxy was learning what happened when conflicts could only be resolved through force. The Nephites, despite their wisdom, proved too detached from immediate concerns to mediate effectively. The Viridians could create beautiful harmony among themselves, but could not bridge the gaps between species with different aesthetic values. The Qatari's militant nature made them unsuited for peacekeeping, as they tended to view all conflicts as battles to be won rather than problems to be solved. The war between the Altarians and Viridians spread rapidly as other species chose, sides based on economic interests and old grievances. The crystalline collective supported the Viridians due to shared artistic sensibilities, while the Qatari backed the Altarians because of military cooperation agreements. Within months, what had started as a mining dispute had divided the galaxy into hostile camps. Professor Alan Brooks watched crop failures spread across a dozen worlds from his agricultural research station on Ceres. The terraforming techniques that had allowed marginal planets to feed billions of beings were failing without human supervision, creating a humanitarian crisis that was rapidly becoming a catastrophe. The atmospheric processors that maintained breathable air on colony worlds were malfunctioning, and the agricultural systems that produced food for non-native species were collapsing. Brooks had spent his career developing the protocols that allowed different species to survive on worlds that had not evolved to support their biology. The work required understanding not just the biological needs of each species, but also how those needs interacted with complex planetary ecosystems. Human agricultural scientists had created a web of interdependent systems that maintained ecological balance while supporting diverse populations. The failure of these systems was creating refugee crises as billions of beings fled worlds that could no longer support life. Atmospheric processors designed by human engineers were shutting down without proper maintenance, leaving entire colonies gasping for breath. Agricultural systems that had been carefully balanced to support multiple species were collapsing as invasive organisms disrupted ecosystems that had been artificially maintained for decades. The refugee crisis was overwhelming the remaining functional worlds as species that had never experienced scarcity found themselves competing for basic resources. The Council's humanitarian response capabilities, they discovered, had been almost entirely dependent on human infrastructure and organizational expertise. Human relief organizations had developed the logistics networks, supply chains, and coordination, protocols that made large-scale humanitarian aid possible. Without those systems, the response to the refugee crisis was chaotic and inadequate. Food shipments arrived at the wrong destinations or spoiled in transit due to improper storage. Medical supplies were distributed without regard for species-specific needs, often proving useless or even harmful to their intended recipients. Temporary housing facilities designed for one species were used to shelter others, creating overcrowding and sanitation problems that led to disease outbreaks. Dr. Jennifer Stone had tried to warn the Council about the psychological foundations of galactic civilization during her years as the galaxy's leading expert on interspecies psychology. Her research had identified humans as what she called harmonic stabilizers, beings whose emotional and intellectual flexibility allowed them to bridge gaps between species that had evolved in completely different environments. Without that bridge, the fundamental incompatibilities between species became unbridgeable chasms. The different species of the galaxy had evolved under vastly different conditions, developing incompatible approaches to everything from social organization to resource management. The Qatari's hive mind mentality conflicted with Altarian individualism. Viridian aesthetic sensibilities were incomprehensible to practical Nephite philosophers. Zephyrian crystalline logic could not process the chaotic creativity of organic species. For centuries, humans had served as translators between these incompatible worldviews, finding ways to make alien concepts understandable across species barriers. Human diplomats, scientists, and traders had developed the mental frameworks that allowed different species to work together despite their fundamental differences. They had created the common language of cooperation that held galactic civilization together. Now that common language was gone, and the galaxy was fragmenting along evolutionary lines as species retreated into their own conceptual frameworks. What had seemed like natural cooperation was revealed to be an artificial construct that required constant human maintenance to function. The final blow came when the ancient Proteus Gate network began shutting down across the galaxy. The faster than light. Travel hubs that connected distant worlds had been quietly maintained by human engineers for decades, their complex systems requiring the kind of intuitive understanding that humans seemed to possess naturally. As the gates failed one by one, the galaxy began fragmenting into isolated regions that could no longer communicate or trade with each other. Commander Rachel Parker coordinated the maintenance shutdown from Luna Base, watching as humanity systematically dismantled the infrastructure that had connected the galaxy for millennia. The Proteus Gates were human innovations, built using principles of space-time manipulation that other species had never fully understood. Alien engineers had learned to operate the gates but had never grasped the underlying physics that made them function. As the gate network collapsed, travel times between distant worlds increased from days to months or years. Trade relationships that had taken centuries to build were severed overnight. Scientific collaborations that had advanced knowledge across the galaxy were reduced to isolated projects that could no longer benefit from shared expertise. In the ruined council chambers on Nexus Prime, only a few dozen representatives remained from the thousands who had once gathered to govern galactic civilization. Most species had withdrawn to their home systems to deal with local crises, abandoning the cooperative framework that had maintained peace and prosperity for millennia. Council leader Zixtal's crystalline form was dim and fractured with stress, patterns as they contemplated the ruins of everything they had believed in. The Zephyrian leader, High. 3 years had passed since humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, and the galaxy that remained was barely recognizable. The grand chambers where thousands of representatives had once gathered to govern a thriving civilization now echoed, with the voices of only a few dozen desperate survivors. The crystal walls that had once reflected the light of a united galaxy were cracked and dim, much like the hope that had once filled this place. Commander Rachel Parker sat in the observation deck of Luna Base, reviewing the daily intelligence, reports that painted a picture of total collapse. 7 major civilizations had fallen completely, their worlds either abandoned or consumed by wars that showed no sign of ending. The galactic economy had contracted by 70% as trade. Networks collapsed and entire sectors became unreachable. Refugee populations numbered in the hundreds of billions, drifting between dying worlds in ships that were slowly failing without proper maintenance. The truth about humanity's role in galactic civilization had finally emerged through the desperate research of Kethar, a young Qatari scholar who had spent the past year studying human contributions to galactic society. Their report was devastating in its completeness, revealing the staggering scope of humanity's integration into every aspect of galactic life. Humans had been responsible for 85% of innovations in interspecies medicine, 90% of successful diplomatic resolutions, 70% of efficient resource distribution systems, and nearly all breakthrough advances in quantum technology that had made modern civilization possible. But Kethar's research revealed something even more fundamental and terrifying. Humans had not simply contributed to galactic civilization, they had been its invisible foundation. The young Qatari's analysis showed that human psychology, with its unique combination of empathy and innovation, cooperation and independence, had created the stable base upon which 3,000 years of galactic peace had rested. Without that foundation, the incompatible evolutionary drives of different species had no common ground on which to build lasting cooperation. Dr. Jennifer Stone had tried to warn the Council about this dependency years before the crisis began. Her research into interspecies psychology had identified humans as what she called harmonic stabilizers, beings whose emotional and intellectual flexibility allowed them to bridge gaps between species that had evolved under completely different conditions. The Qatari hive mind mentality, Viridian aesthetic obsessions, Nephite philosophical detachment, and Zephyrian crystalline logic were fundamentally incompatible worldviews that could only coexist through human mediation. The final collapse of galactic infrastructure came when the ancient Proteus Gate network shut down completely. The faster-than-light travel hubs that had connected distant worlds for millennia went dark one by one, leaving entire sectors isolated and unreachable. The maintenance of these gates had been quietly managed by human engineers who understood the complex physics involved in manipulating space-time on such a massive scale. Without their expertise, the gates simply stopped functioning, fragmenting the galaxy into isolated islands of failing civilization. Engineer Kyle Davis had overseen the gate network from the primary control station in the Alpha Centauri system for 15 years before receiving the withdrawal order. His team of human technicians had maintained over 2,000 gates across the galaxy, coordinating maintenance schedules, troubleshooting problems, and implementing upgrades that kept the ancient technology functioning far beyond its original design specifications. The gates were human innovations built on mathematical principles that other species found difficult to understand and impossible to replicate. As the gates failed, travel times between distant worlds increased from days to months or years. Scientific collaborations that had advanced knowledge across the galaxy were reduced to isolated projects on individual worlds. Trade relationships that had taken centuries to build were severed overnight as entire sectors became economically unreachable. The galactic community that had seemed so permanent and stable simply ceased to exist. In the ruins of the council chambers, Zixtel made one final desperate attempt to contact humanity. The Zephyrian Council leader's crystalline form was fractured with stress patterns that spoke of complete psychological breakdown. Their carefully ordered world of proper hierarchy and civilized governance had crumbled into chaos that their structured mind could not process. The message they broadcast toward the Sol system carried the weight of 3 years of mounting desperation. The plea was simple and heartbreaking in its honesty. They understood now that they had been wrong about humanity's value to galactic civilization. They acknowledged that humans had been essential partners rather than problems to be managed. They begged for humanity to return and help rebuild what had been lost. The galaxy was dying without the foundation that humans had provided, and the remaining species were finally ready to admit their complete dependence on human expertise and mediation. The response came not from Earth, but from a probe that emerged from the quantum barrier surrounding the Sol system. The barrier itself was a marvel of human engineering that no other species could penetrate or understand, a perfect demonstration of how far human technology had advanced during their years of isolation. The probe carried a message from President Helen Ross that was both diplomatic and final in its rejection of the Council's plea. The message acknowledged the Council's recognition of their mistake, but made it clear that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. Humanity had offered partnership and been given condescension. They had provided essential services and received only criticism and restrictions in return. The galaxy had chosen to see humans as a problem rather than recognizing them as the foundation that held everything together. Now, the galaxy would have to live with the consequences of that choice. The probe's secondary data burst revealed the extent of human advancement during their isolation. While the galaxy had collapsed into chaos, humanity had not been idle, advanced. Terraforming projects had created dozens of new garden worlds within human space. Population was booming as humans spread across systems that could support billions of people. Technology had advanced by centuries as human scientists focused their efforts on internal development rather than maintaining alien systems. Most devastating was the revelation that humanity no longer needed anything from the galaxy that had rejected them. They had achieved complete technological independence, developing new methods of faster-than-light travel, energy production, and resource management that made them entirely self-sufficient. The species that had once depended on galactic trade and cooperation had built a civilization that was more advanced and prosperous than anything the galaxy had ever seen. The final scenes of galactic collapse played out across dying worlds as the last. Functional governments withdrew to their home systems and abandoned any pretense of interstellar cooperation. The Qatari retreated to their hive worlds and resumed their ancestral warrior culture. The Viridians lost themselves in increasingly abstract artistic pursuits as their technological infrastructure crumbled. The Nephites meditated on the philosophical implications of civilizational collapse, while their world slowly died around them. On Earth, children played in parks beneath alien stars that were now just distant lights in a sky that held no threat or promise of contact. These children grew up hearing stories of a galaxy full of wonders that their grandparents had once explored, but they felt no sense of loss for worlds they had never seen. Their excitement was focused on the vast human space that stretched before them, filled with new worlds to explore and civilizations to build. In the abandoned council chambers, Zixtal's crystalline form finally darkened completely as the last power systems failed and the great building that had once housed Galactic. Government became a tomb for the civilization that had destroyed itself through arrogance and ingratitude. The galaxy had learned too late what Earth had always known. Sometimes the quiet ones who hold everything together are only noticed when they are gone. The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet that the Council had once celebrated, but the empty silence of a civilization that had forgotten how to speak to itself. The galaxy had chosen isolation over cooperation, superiority over partnership, and pride over wisdom. Now it would remain silent forever, a cautionary tale written in the ruins of 1,000 worlds about the price of taking essential things for granted. Humanity had walked away without a word, and the galaxy had fallen exactly as they had predicted it would.